Hello, this video is on life in Elizabethan England. We have so far looked at the domestic threats to Elizabeth. We've also looked at the foreign threats, and now we are looking at what it was actually like to live in Elizabethan England. And obviously this was very different depending on who you were. We need to firstly understand what was the structure of Elizabethan society, because as I was just saying, life was very different for people at the top of this order or hierarchy compared with those at the bottom. This is the structure. You have got the monarch, the queen at the top, the nobility down below, who are landowners, but they're landowners who have been given a title by the monarch. And a title is, for example, being called a duke or being called an earl. And you are given this title because you are respected by the monarch and possibly one of her friends. The gentry below are also powerful landowners, but they do not have a title, but they're also rich. The monarch, the nobility, and the gentry are a tiny proportion of Elizabethan society, but they have huge amounts of power because they have so much land. And also the nobility and the gentry have power because they are listened to by the monarch. And they're listened to partly through a privy council. So the monarch has advisors called her privy council, and nobility and gentry will be in that. Additionally, the nobility and the gentry will be the only people who will be sitting in the parliament, passing the laws that Elizabeth wants to be passed. So they have huge amounts of influence and power, and they control the land. They rent out land to yeomen, and yeomen are farmers. Some of these would be quite wealthy. They might have farms that are several hundred acres, some far less, but they rent the land. They don't actually own it because the land is owned by the monarch, nobility, and gentry. The yeomen don't do most of the farming themselves because their land is too large for that, and so they get peasants who are the labouring poor to do the work for them. They give them a small strip of land that they can work on themselves, and they spend the rest of their time working on the yeoman's land, making the yeoman fairly well off, but obviously the peasants remain extremely poor. However, they're not at the bottom of the pile. That is the vagrants and the homeless. Vagrants and homeless are the same thing. So these are people that perhaps have been made unemployed because of problems we'll look at in a minute. And so the only way really for them to survive is to beg. And so they go through the villages, towns and cities, desperately trying to get people to give them money because it's very difficult for them to find any alternative work. So we're going to start at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and we're going to look at the life of the homeless. And we're going to do that by asking this question: why there was an increase in poverty in Elizabethan England, which was dramatic. There was a huge increase, and the reason for that we can remember with the mnemonic sheep, S-H-E-E-P. Okay, here we go. So the first reason why there was a dramatic increase in poverty, and poverty, by the way, means that you have to spend 80% or more of your money on bread. So these are people in desperate situations. So 80% of all money they earn has to be spent on bread, literally bread, because they need that to survive, but it means they don't have any money for clothes, very little money for accommodation, and they really are in a desperate position. So the first reason why there was such a dramatic increase in poverty is because of the increase in sheep farming. Now, the nobles and the gentry and also many yeomen were interested in sheep farming because sheep farming provides not just meat but also wool. And wool was expensive and could be exported to Europe, where it could be sold in markets in the Netherlands and could make you considerable amounts of money. And so sheep farming replaced farming of crops. But the problem with this was that it meant that far fewer workers were needed. The number of shepherds was far less than the number of peasants required to harvest crops and plant crops. As a result, high levels of unemployment, and because there were less crops being planted and grown, it meant that the amount of food available in the country was less, and as a result, there was inflation, which meant that food prices went up, and the unemployed found it very, very difficult to actually pay for any of this food. Next up, you've got the H, which is for harvests. There were 4 years of bad harvests during Elizabeth's reign. A poor harvest means that the crops fail. The crops fail to grow. Certainly don't grow in the same amount in the same volume as they do in other years. This was because of issues with the weather, inclement weather, poor weather during those years, and as a result, less food meant that the prices of the food that was available rocketed. There was high levels of inflation, and it meant that those at the bottom of society found it very, very difficult because there just wasn't enough food for them. Next up, E is for the embargo, and an embargo is when you stop someone trading. As we heard under S for sheep, much of England was given over to sheep farming because they wanted to grow sheep in order to use their wool. But the place where this wool was then exported to was markets in the Netherlands, where it was then sold all around Europe. The problem is that the Netherlands is part of Philip II's Spanish Empire, and because of issues with the privateers and Philip II's general dislike of Elizabeth I, he banned the export of this wool, which meant that it was very difficult for the yeomen and then the nobles and the gentry to be able to make much money from wool farming, and so they simply got rid of many of their workers, they sacked them, and as a result there were higher levels of unemployment. Next up, E is for enclosure. Before the time of Henry VIII, who was Elizabeth I's father, there was considerable amounts of common land in England. Common land was land where farmers could choose to grow their own crops or to graze their animals. However, what Henry VIII did is he enclosed huge amounts of the land, which meant he turned it into individual fields so that he could then sell it to nobility and gentry. As a result, there was far less common land for poorer people to use, and as a result, there was higher levels of suffering because people weren't able to grow their own crops. And as we have heard earlier, it was very difficult to get jobs on farms because there was less demand for workers. Finally, P is for population. There was a population explosion while Elizabeth was queen. The population went up from 3 million to 4 million in the years 1551 to 1601. And of course, this meant that there was much higher demand for the food that was available. And it was another reason why prices rocketed and resulted in high inflation for food, making it very difficult for most people to even afford the basics. So, what did Elizabeth do about poverty in England? Well, the first thing she did, and to be honest, almost everyone did, was that they divided the poor into two groups. They divided them into the able-bodied poor. Able-bodied poor are people who are essentially able to look after themselves but are poor nonetheless. And these people were considered to be poor because they were lazy. On the other hand, there was the impotent poor, and the impotent poor were people who were ill or were elderly, and they were seen as acceptable. It was seen as acceptable that they were poor, and so they were provided with help, while the able-bodied poor were considered to be lazy, and therefore it was their own fault that they were suffering. So what did Elizabeth do about the poverty? She had to do something because there was a serious risk of rioting if she didn't take action, because so many people were struggling to survive. So she used this. 2 positives and 1 negative. Firstly, because she was a good Christian, a Protestant, as we know, she felt it was her Christian duty to help the impotent poor. And so she created the 1563 Statute of Artificers. Statute is a law, and under this law, it was everyone's responsibility to help the impotent poor, and they helped the impotent poor by providing tax money. So they had to pay taxes, and if they failed to do so, they would be fined or even imprisoned. And this meant there was more money available for the impotent poor. Next up, Elizabeth, like everyone else, as we've heard, believed that the able-bodied were indolent. Indolent is a good word to use in exams. Indolent means lazy. So the indolent poor, they needed to be punished in order that they changed their ways and started to try to look for work, or at least that's what the Elizabethans thought. So in 1572, there was the Vagabonds Act. And a vagabond is someone who is homeless and begs to try to get food and money from other people. So they use a 3 strikes and you are out approach. First time you were caught begging in a town or a city, you had a hole drilled in your ear so that people could tell that you were a vagabond and would not give you anything. If you persisted in your ways of begging, then you were placed into prison for a period of time. And if you then continued to beg after you left that second time, then you were hanged as a way of warning others to not follow your path. However, by 1576, the situation was so bleak in England because of the harvests and because of the problems that England was facing with Spain, which had led to the embargo. Elizabeth had little choice but to start to positively help the able-bodied poor, and did this by creating the 1576 Poor Relief Act. An act is a law. Under this law, the able-bodied poor were given some wool or other raw material, and they had the option then of trying to turn it into some sort of product or turn it into cloth or something like that in order that they could then sell it. And once they'd sold it, they would then be able to, of course, make a small profit, and that would be enough, hopefully, that was the idea, for them to be able to afford bread. Now, we're going to look at what it was like across all of society in terms of education. And we do this with a kind of a view to be able to answer a question that might come up, like education in England improved during the reign of Elizabeth I. How far do you agree? And if we were answering this question, we would firstly disagree, or certainly this picture would disagree, because if you were a peasant, then you were very unlikely to receive any education at all. You would simply, from a young age, work on the field like your parents and grandparents, and you would never learn to read and write. And certainly if you were a girl, there was almost no chance whatsoever that you would receive any education at all. Now, under Elizabeth's reign, at the start of her reign, 1558, 80% of boys were illiterate and men were illiterate, which means they could not read and write. By the end of her reign, that number was 70%, could not read or write. So you could argue there was a slight improvement. However, for the vast majority of peasants, life remained exactly as it had done before Elizabeth I, with no chances of learning even a basic education. The second group was the gentry and the nobility, and life for their children, or education for their children, did not really change at all. Prior to Elizabeth becoming queen, they were educated at home, and this continued while Elizabeth was on the throne. They would be educated by a governess, a female teacher, until they were older, and then they would be educated perhaps by someone who had studied at university, who would teach them some of the key information they needed, such as how to speak Latin and Greek, perhaps how to read, took some understanding of some English poetry, but nothing practical, because these were people who would not be working. They might be doing, supporting Elizabeth in politics, but they would not be working, so their education was very limited. However, there was one group that did quite dramatically benefit during Elizabeth's reign, and these were the middle classes, particularly middle classes who lived in the towns and cities. So they're not in the order that we looked at the start, and that is because these are people who lived in urban areas. And life did begin to change for their children. And it did so because more petty schools were set up, and these were pretty poor schools that were set up for children up to the age of 10, providing a very basic level of education in a woman or man's home that you'd have to pay a small amount of money for. I put that down, if I was writing this essay, as a disagree, that education improved, because the petty schools were definitely not particularly positive. However, what was positive was that the children of the middle class in cities, and some rural areas too, could go to grammar schools, and these grammar schools provided a very academic education, the learning of Latin and Greek and philosophy and all sorts of other things that you'd get in a highly academic education. And this went on to the age of 14. And there were also 70 were set up, by the way, when Elizabeth was queen. And secondly, you have universities, Oxford and Cambridge. These have been around for several hundred years. However, both universities expanded, which means they grew, during the Elizabethan period, with more colleges being set up, which was done because Elizabeth was desperate to create more Protestant priests in order to fill the churches. And the only way to do that was to train them up. And the training centres for priests at that time were Oxford and Cambridge universities. Now, we're getting higher up the social hierarchy. We're now looking at what it was like to be one of the wealthier members of Elizabethan society, as we shall see in a minute. Question that might come up: why were there more voyages of discovery in Elizabethan England? And this question could also be, why was there more exploration? It could be something, why were there more journeys made to other countries? And remember, this is the time when the New World was being discovered by Spain and also Portugal. And English people were also pretty keen to see what they could find in North and South America, and with the hope that they would be able to make their fortune there. So why were there more voyages of discovery in Elizabethan England? The way you can learn this is through TAP, T-A-P. Well, firstly, because technology improved, which meant that it was possible to cross the Atlantic with a little bit less risk than it had ever been done previously, and you needed to cross the Atlantic to get to the New World. The English had developed and designed a new form of galleon that had a larger hull, and the hull is the area underneath the deck where goods could be stored and raw materials could be stored. The hulls were larger on the newer galleons, which meant it was possible to travel to the New World and pick up more raw materials, and therefore bring more raw materials back to Europe, where you could sell them at a large profit. So it made more sense to travel because of this technological improvement. And secondly, it became safer and easier to travel across the Atlantic because of improvements in technologies around map making and technologies around being able to see exactly where you were at any one time. For example, astrolabes. And astrolabes are devices like the one you can see there. And these devices allowed sailors to navigate using the stars, meaning that they would not get lost at night. The second reason why there was this increase in these voyages of discovery was because of young men keen to embark upon an adventure, particularly the younger sons of gentry. So the oldest son of the gentry would inherit the father's land, which would be lots of lots of land, as we know, and they would be able to become quite wealthy. However, the younger sons would not inherit the land, and so they had fewer options. They could, for example, become a priest, but many preferred the idea of going on an exciting trip to the New World, where they hoped that they would be able to make their fortune. And the final reason why people went on these voyages of discovery were because there were genuinely considerable amounts of profits to be made if you were successful in your travels to the New World. You could make huge profits in three ways. You could make profits as a privateer, and many people were inspired by Sir Francis Drake, who between 1577 and 1580, as we know, stole £400,000 of Spanish gold and silver as a privateer. Secondly, it was possible to make a fortune as a slave trader, taking slaves or kidnapping slaves or Africans and forcing them into slavery in the New World, selling them to plantation owners who were Spanish in South America. And finally, you could collect raw materials such as cotton and sugar and even potatoes and take them back to Europe, where you could sell them at a large profit. So, final thing in this section, why was the colonization of Virginia a disaster? So, as we know, it was very difficult for England to colonize South America because South America had been taken over and colonized by Spain and Portugal. So England was forced to try to colonize the North of America, what we call today the United States. It was not called that then. And so Walter Raleigh, in 1584, he set up a colony in Virginia. However, as you can see from the question, the colony was a disaster. And a question that can come up is, why did the colony of Virginia fail to become a success? And the answer is, again, a useful mnemonic, FOGS, F-O-G-S, FOGS. So what were the reasons for the failure of this colonization? Well, the first reason is because of issues with the food supply. The ships that went out to the New World were equipped with seeds and food so that the new settlers would be able to not only eat the supplies for a little while, but also plant seeds which would allow them to have crops that they could then eat. However, big problem was that the crops, some of the food was destroyed on board one of the ships called the Tiger, which meant there wasn't sufficient food, and the seeds, which were in barrels on board the same ship, they became waterlogged and they were not able to use them. As a result, it became very difficult for the settlers to support themselves in the new colonies. Second thing is the G, and the G is for the gentry. The gentry were not prepared to get their hands dirty, as we know from the start of this session. They were very close to the top of the social hierarchy, and they didn't feel it was their responsibility to actually do any work, which was a bit ridiculous because there weren't that many people on board the boats, on board these ships, and so the settlements couldn't really work unless everyone was prepared to do their bit. However, the gentry weren't. Additionally, on board the boats, there were not enough people with the skills to actually be able to really make a colony survive. There were far too few farmers, and as a result, the colonies weren't sustainable, which means they couldn't last over a period of time because people simply didn't have the expertise to be able to keep them going, particularly when they were faced with the problems of the tiger and the issue with the seeds we've just heard about. Finally, is because of the supernatural. There was a huge problem, which was that the native Indians did not trust the white settlers, and they didn't trust them because, firstly, they kept asking them for help, and secondly, Chief Wingina and others began to think that the settlers might be the cause of the ill health and diseases that they themselves were getting, and he was probably right, because they were passing on diseases that they'd brought over from Europe. And as a result, not only did the Native Americans stop supporting the white settlers, but they also began to attack them in the hope that they would go away, which did actually finally lead to people leaving Virginia, because life was so difficult for the settlers. They decided they'd had enough, and so they left Virginia, and that was the end of Sir Walter Raleigh's attempt to colonize that part of North America. So that is what it was like to live in Elizabethan England. Please do look in the booklet, of course, for more information. I've not gone through leisure, because I thought this was already long enough. But if you want to learn about leisure, which surely you do, you need to do so from the booklet. All the best.